Good afternoon to our US viewers and good evening to those watching us in Europe. And thank you for joining us for today's discussion. My name is Jörn Fleck and I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center here at the Atlantic Council. And I'm pleased to welcome all of you to this timely panel discussion on the future of Zeitenwende, 1 year since Germany's historic turning point. As most of our viewers will know, 1 year ago, just days after Russia launched its illegal invasion of Ukraine and forced a geopolitical rewiring of Europe and its security environment, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced sweeping new measures in his so-called Zeitenwende speech before the German Bundestag. What stood out from the speech to most international observers was the announcement of a 100 billion euro special budget for Germany's ailing military and a pledge to raise German defense spending to the 2% NATO goal, 2% of GDP in coming years. But beyond the mere increases in defense spending, Putin's open war against Ukraine had challenged many long-held principles of German policy, especially in its relationship with Russia. So that the new German chancellor at the time, his speech quickly came to signal not only that defense spending measure and investments, but also a more fundamental shift in German foreign and defense policy, and maybe even foreign policy culture and mentality that would amount to a turning point or Zeitenwende. In the years since the announcements, Zeitenwende has been added to our standard vocabulary from Washington to Brussels to Berlin. We've seen Germany become the third largest supplier of military aid to Ukraine and among the largest among EU members. German weapon deliveries have increased in scale in line with requests from Ukraine and European allies, including heavy weaponry, longer range artillery, air defense systems, and most recently, the pledge of modern Leopard 2 tanks. I think it's also clear 1 year on that there's still a long way to go. Germany's yet to reach this threshold of spending 2% of its GDP on defense in line with the Wales summit pledge. And while Germany has responded to Ukrainian requests for aid, critics point to the delays and maybe delaying tactics that have for some have called into question not only Germany's commitment to Ukraine, but also whether a true Zeitenwende is really taking place in German foreign and defense policy. To help us assess the first year of Zeitenwende and unpack many of the related issues, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished panel today that can help us break down what is happening in Berlin, how we assess the first year of Zeitenwende and the outlook for the future. So joining us today are Dr. Liana Fix, Fellow for Europe with the Council on Foreign Relations and now here in Washington, D.C. Liana, warm welcome. We have Tyson Barker, non-resident senior fellow with the Europe Center here at the Atlantic Council. Joining us from Berlin is Britta Jakob, who's senior manager for strategic foreign policy at Bayer AG and served previously as a foreign policy advisor in the German Foreign Office and also to the Green Party parliamentary group. And then last but certainly not least, joining us from Tartu, but usually in Bratislava, is Alina Kutsko, Vice President for Policy and Programming at the GlobeSec think tank in Slovakia. Thank you all for joining us. Look forward to this discussion. For those in the audience watching online, please submit your questions to the speakers using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and make sure that you follow the discussion on Twitter at AC Europe and at Atlantic Council. And so thanks again for joining us. I'll start and kick off with Liana. You were based in Berlin at the time on February 27th. Maybe you can take us back to that day, to a Sunday a year ago, and give us your sort of initial reactions when you saw the speech, heard of the initial impressions. And then as a second part, you're now in Washington, D.C. 1 year on. It's a different debate. give us your initial quick takeaways of how you think we should view the Zeitenwende 1 year on.
Thanks so much, Jörn, and wonderful to be here on such a wonderful panel and to discuss Zeitenwende, really timely just before, not just before actually, he should be just about arriving Olaf Scholz's visit to DC, where he wants to again underline that Zeitenwende 1 year on is still going on and has not failed. But going back to February 24, the day of Russia's attack on Ukraine and also of Olaf Scholz's speech in the German Bundestag, on a personal level, I, as everyone, was obviously very shocked after the attack on Ukraine. But I also remember that Olaf Scholz's speech in the German Bundestag at that point seemed to me the absolute appropriate response to what was happening. And I just want to remind all of us that this speech was given 3 days after the invasion. So at that time, it was, from a German perspective, but also from a US perspective, not clear that Ukraine would be able to push back Russian forces and would be able to remain an independent country. So it was very much under the impression of Russia at the gates that this speech was given and why it seemed appropriate. The other reason why I was less surprised to hear this speech is because I perceived it less as an ambitious new policy, but as an emergency brake, because Germany was heading into the wrong direction in 3 crucial policy areas, and that was energy policy, defense policy, and support for Ukraine, where Germany was not helping Ukraine with weapons, where Germany was dependent on Russian gas, and where Germany was not able to contribute to its own defense and to the defense of its allies. So it was an emergency brake back then, and it has evolved since then into a policy which has lost some of its urgency of the immediate days after the attack on Ukraine. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons which helps to explain why after 1 year, especially from a Washington perspective, there are basically 3 problems with Zeitenwende. The one is the strategic communications problem, and I don't think I have to say too much about that. There's really no other country where the gap between actual contributions and reputation is wider than when it comes to Germany. But there's also an implementation problem of Zeitenwende, just very basics of how do you spend 100 billion once you've provided them? And the third problem is a leadership problem. And that was very, very visible in the tank debate about the Leopards, that despite Zeitenwende, Germany wants to be part of the alliance, but it doesn't want to put its head above the power pit. So it's not assuming a leading role in Europe. And I think those are the 3 challenges which the Chancellor, but also the new defense minister, who's trying to push Zeitenwende forward, will have to address in year 2.
Thank you very much, Liana. Great overview. So more of a inevitable discussion, reaction at the time than really a grand strategic plan, is your point. And then we will come back to the strategic communications implementation and leadership problem in the discussion. But I want to turn to Tyson as an American in Berlin, having a unique vantage point. A lot of the discussion initially, the attention-grabbing item was that 100 billion, but I think Zeitenwende has also become a much broader concept, right? That talks about sort of a mentality shift speaks to a mentality shift in Germany when it comes to foreign defense, but even energy and technology policy and other concepts where Germany has lacked strategy and maybe security proofing. Give us your assessment in that broader sense of a cultural shift from Zeitenwende 1 year on.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Jorn, and thanks for having me. I mean, I think Liana gets it really right when she highlights the fact that the expectation in the Chancellery at the moment that the Zeitenwende speech was given was that Russia would be successful relatively quickly. And that created a sense of urgency that led to something that is not very common in German policymaking, which is an abrupt shift, a punctuated equilibrium shift, where you roll out a whole set of new policies that are essentially supposed to cascade into other areas. I mean, just in that week, and I think we remember that Wednesday, Scholz, the day before the invasion, made the announcement that Germany would suspend Nord Stream 2, which was already relatively quick. It came before the invasion began. And things were moving so rapidly that once it became clear that Ukraine was going to be able to hold its own despite the massive atrocities that were occurring in its territory in places like Bucha, that the urgency on the defense side started to relax. And we see that in a kind of return to, let's say, modus operandi to some extent in the culture and the chancellery, where the natural inclination was to put brakes on action. And you saw this in many different iterations on weapons deliveries over the course of the past year. Oftentimes, when communicating domestically, the chancellor and his team would talk about the need to coordinate with allies and the constant necessity of allied coordination. That message is not necessarily consistent with the kind of the dynamics that were playing out in places like NATO and in the US-German relationship, where the expectation or the hope would be that Germany would perhaps start to move a little bit. But the idea of conditioning support for Ukraine, specifically on weapons delivery and lifting export controls, was always kind of contingent on US action and outsourcing the decision to the US, which was not necessarily the actual way that it was playing out, although that's how it was being sold domestically. The one area where the urgency remained, and I think that has a great deal to do with pressure from the private sector, specifically energy-intensive private sector in areas like steel and chemicals, is in a shift in Germany's energy posture, because it became very clear that the sword of Damocles over one of its primary pillars of energy source, namely gas through the Nord Stream pipeline, was in a precarious position. And Germany's shift to phase out nuclear energy, its attempt to kind of roll down reliance on coal, was going to create a lot of pressure for Germany's industrial competitiveness if action wasn't taken relatively quickly. And this is an area where I think that the Chancellery and the government deserves a great deal of credit in implementing a Zeitenwende in Germany's energy positioning. They quickly started construction of 5 offshore LNG terminals, 3 of which have already come online, started to build new relationships with partners that hadn't existed in the past outside of the Euro-Atlantic region, specifically with the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, looking for new sources for LNG. The Chancellor made a decision to extend the life of some of Germany's nuclear power plants that were slated to be shuttered this year in order to get over the hump. The provisions for gas reserves were filled at record speed and remain, I believe, just under 90% at capacity. And the government put in place a cost cushion, which in many ways was a unilateral move by Germany, but gave a cushion to energy costs for German industry and consumers over the winter, a 200 billion outlay on energy costs. And all of this is something that I think that Scholz reflects on as extremely successful. And he highlighted this in a speech he gave at Davos, where I think he has started to shift away from the use of Zeitenwende and to a new phrase. So if Zeitenwende was the term for 2022, we are now talking about very German word, Deutschlandgeschwindigkeit, or German speed, German pacing. And I think there's a lot to talk about that was successful on the energy front. Now, in some of the other areas that it was supposed to unlock, namely in areas of industrial policy, tech policy, I think that there's a lot to be desired, but we can discuss this in the discussion later.
Thank you, Tyson, for that overview. We won't let the Chancellor quite get away with a reframing of Deutschlandgeschwindigkeit, at least in this discussion. But good point to return to. So you're saying, probably in the energy and energy transition sector, that's where Zeitenwende has made big progress. I wanted to turn to Britta. This is a good segue as someone who both comes with a private sector perspective now, working for one of Germany's leading companies on exactly these geopolitical implications, but also someone who was at the Foreign Office advising the Foreign Office leadership at the time. Maybe from both of those vantages, a combined perspective with both of these vantage points on the first year, and what you see as your assessment.
Thank you, Jörn, and thank you so much for having me. Well, you know, I think we still seem to have these two different interpretations, basically, of the term Zeitenwende. And this has also an impact on how you assess this first year of Zeitenwende and the result of it, because I remember when we had a discussion, I think it was a few days after the Chancellor's speech last year, a transatlantic conversation also hosted by Atlantic Council, and there were huge expectations. I remember that from the US side, as if it was the moment when Germany was like rising like phoenix from the ashes when it comes to security, resilience, defense. And I was skeptic back then, and I'm quite skeptic now. And why is that? Because I thought already 1 year ago in this speech, when the Chancellor said we have experienced a Zeitenwende, that to me this was, you know, meaning that Zeitenwende, at least to the Chancellor, meant a turning point regarding world events, regarding what happened right now, the brutal attack on Ukraine from Russia. But it does not necessarily mean a long-term shift in German policy. So we have to acknowledge, of course, and I'm completely with Tyson on that, really give credit on what happened during this year. There were measures being taken, especially when it comes to reducing energy dependency from Russia in no time. When it comes to delivery of military support also to Ukraine, when it comes to burying Nord Stream 2, so all of these measures were really, really good, and also the establishing a real unity in the transatlantic alliance, NATO, G7, EU. I mean, we experienced coming from westlessness to westfulness, right? Although, of course, we also lost some partners in the global south, but maybe we can talk about that a little later. But yeah, there was a lot was really achieved. But in my assessment, it's not really, you know, that it has sunk in as a mentality, as you said, Jörn. And I think we also have to differentiate the two areas in energy, for example, or the whole transition to a climate neutral economy. I mean, this was on the agenda of the government anyway. So the war basically was like an accelerator to do that. There was a lot of time pressure. Okay, now we really have to act. But it was already on the agenda before that. We have to transform our energy system and reduce dependency. What was maybe not so much on the agenda was taking a leading role, shaping foreign and security policy, although this was in the debate years and years ago already. But this is not the role that I would say Germany really embraced to have. I think, yes, a lot was done and was achieved, but I'm really skeptic in if that would be a comprehensive and effective and now quick turnaround or shift in German policy. I don't really see that, also because of missing governance structures, or the structures within the government as I see them. Maybe to mention missing National Security Council. Maybe it will come, we will see, but that's definitely missing for as a space for coordinate foreign and security policy. Or if we look at the broken military procurement system, which is crucial in such a moment and which is not there. And we have a three-party coalition in Germany with a lot of internal interests and competition and controversies. So all of that, given this situation and these structures, to me, it's not really the best way to start for a comprehensive policy shift and Zeitenwende. Oh, and maybe, Jörn, may I just go back also to your point on private sector, maybe just two sentences on that, because I really do think that the belief that economic ties in business are like somehow separate from the political realm this time is over. So everyone really knows, okay, there's no business as usual anymore. And companies are realizing more and more that geopolitical risk analysis foresight is really crucial for them as a business, but also for the political decisions, because political decisions have their effects on business, on the industry, but also vice versa. So you really can't think it separately anymore. It has to go hand in hand. It's two sides of the same coin. And that's what I'm also assessing now in my new role. Although when you have the perspective now there from the private sector, you also see how complex and difficult all of this is once the economic ties got so close. It's really, from a political point of view, of course, it's necessary to also make a shift there in strategies, but on the ground, it's really a huge challenge ahead of us.
Thank you, Britta. So an expectations game and different understandings of Zeitenwende, not so much as a strategy, but as a lived experience, you're saying. I want to turn to Elina. Elina, a big criticism of German foreign policy, energy policy, European policy before Putin's open war and full-scale invasion in February of last year was always a sense of German arrogance and neglect at best of Central and Eastern European perspectives and the allies in Central and Eastern Europe. From your vantage point, sitting in Bratislava usually, how do you think Central Europe is looking at the first year of Zeitenwende and the shift or lack thereof of German in German foreign and defense policy and specifically also support for Ukraine?
Thank you so much, Jörn, and thank you so much, the Atlantic Council, for organizing this conversation. I'll probably say the thing that everybody expects me to say right now, and from a psychological standpoint, it does feel good to know that we were not chronically paranoid, as some thought that we were. But it would feel even better if we were confident that the future policy on Russia incorporates the right and effective measures, and we're not sure that we're there yet. We all know that it's not the Germany that it used to be that we're dealing with right now, but also in Central Europe, there's a widespread feeling that it's not yet the Germany that we would all love to have. Of course, there are still certain frustrations with the German policy, especially about the famous Geschwindigkeit that Central Europeans think is not fast enough for sure. And there are good reasons for that. Like, first reason, and that one is probably the most obvious one, is that old habits die hard. The trust towards Germany was being ruined for years, so it's going to take quite a few years to make sure that we can rebuild this trust. Of course, then there also comes the slow action of Germany. It's been very hard this year to get Germany to commit to what seems pretty obvious and necessary course of action. Germany would eventually do so, but so much effort and time is being put into it that eventually the frustrations amount. And then there is also an important point that all these commitments actually need to be converted into real deliveries and actions. And again, in German case, there is a certain time gap between saying something, committing to something, and then following up on the commitments. But more systemically and looking into the future, Central Europeans are still not entirely sure whether we are on the same page with Germany regarding the future. Whether we have the same ideas about how to achieve the peace, or whether we have the same ideas about what possible relations Europeans can have with Russia when the war is over. Going back to this idea about Germany's staying power, all previous speakers said that there was certain urgency in Germany right after the beginning of the invasion, but this urgency seems to be waning right now. And the bigger question is whether there is going to be still urgency as the years go by and the conflict potentially becomes protracted. But it's also fair to say that the scorecard of Germany is much more balanced and nuanced than that. First, everybody understands that actually Germany has moved a lot and is doing things that even last year were pretty unimaginable, including and importantly in terms of supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine and making important budgetary commitments. But also, Central Europeans know more than others that it's not just about financial aid. It's also about not about only military aid to Ukraine. It's also about the financial aid. It's also about financing European instruments that are helping others to provide aid to Ukraine. I'm talking about financing of the, for example, European Peace Facility or economic instruments that are helping other Europeans to do the good things. Importantly, it really depends on where you are in Central Europe, because what Germany often is doing is it might not be ready to provide certain types of weapons directly to Ukraine, but it's ready to backfill the capabilities that other allies are giving to Ukraine. So if you're sitting in Slovakia, actually Germany is a very good ally for you, because Germany, by filling some of the gaps in Slovak defenses, allowed Slovakia to be much bolder and much more proactive in giving what it can to Ukraine. So basically, to sum up, I think if there was an award for the most approved ally, Germany would definitely win it. But of course, Central Europeans would prefer Germany to also to win the award for the best performer in Europe, because without Germany collectively, we're probably not going to be able to be where we want to be.
Thank you, Alina. So again, back to implementation and expectations, right? And perception issues. Maybe I can turn to Liana, back to especially the defense pillar and the implementation of that 100 billion euro off budget, the investment, the 2% target, which the chancellor doubled down on again in his speech this morning in the Bundestag, European time, in terms of what Zeitenwende 1 year on, right? And so what do you think are some of the real challenges underlying the implementation of this push for defense spending renewal in this particular government and the three-way complex coalition and the backdrop of public policy, public opinion, obviously?
Yeah, so I think the one benchmark to look out for, whether Zeitenwende or it's correct, the term was not Zeitenwende itself, but the circumstances what Zeitenwende is what I outlined. So the one benchmark to look out for, if it has worked or not, are the 2% and the 2% in the next 5 years. Because what we have now is that the Chancellor promised in his speech 1 year ago that from now on, Germany will spend every year 2%. He has walked back this pledge already in Munich and then again in his speech in the German Bundestag, because there was an implementation realization that spending 2% right now will be difficult, because it's just difficult to spend 100 billion if you only start concluding contracts with the defense industry 1 year after. And the crucial question mark in the next years will be that the special fund is only limited to 5 years. So it's limited to basically the term of this government. And the question is, what comes next? Will there be another special fund which will relieve the government of making difficult concessions for the regular defense budget, which basically remained the same? If the regular defense budget will be upgraded to 2%, then there will be significant costs to be made in other policy areas, possibly social policy. And that will be the defining mark and the defining benchmark, whether there's really a willingness to pull this through, not only with special funds which are outside of the regular budget, but really with cuts in other policy areas. So that's what I would look out for. When and how will Germany reach the 2% benchmark beyond the special fund in the next 5 years? And let me also add that the NATO discussion is going into another direction. The NATO discussion is going towards 2.5% and 3%. which Germany obviously doesn't want to go with because it feels that the flag post is pushed further and further ahead. Perhaps one comment also on the energy part. I would agree that this was the most successful part, but I also, just to be fair, wanted to mention that Germany's plans were to reduce dependency from Russian gas by mid-2024. So it was because Russia stopped providing gas to Germany in the last year that Germany is in a position where it is right now, where it is relatively where it can survive without significant Russian gas supplies. So it was not only Germany's willingness and its strong implementation here, but it was also because it was forced by Russia. And I think the other aspect, and we only touched upon this slightly, I think is really the question of coalition coordination, because we have this three-party coalition in Berlin, and to the outside world, it is often absolutely not clear who is speaking for the government in this coalition, and if the government is speaking with one voice. I mean, I think this started very much with putting the Zeitenwende speech together, where only a small circle was involved in the planning. And then it continued later with the tank debate, for example, where entirely contradictory messages were coming out of Berlin. And this adds to the confusion of the outside world, together with these discussions about National Security Council, yes or no, which seems to tend now towards no, which would be really a setback in the institutional structure of policy coordination in Germany. And perhaps the last point, and I want to end on a more upbeat note about the implementation. I do think the new defense minister is balancing out some of the weaknesses that Olaf Scholz has, which is very welcome and very much needed. And he's providing a kind of narrative of strength and willingness, which is important and which the chancellor also had at the beginning. And I want to say why this was so important at the beginning, because when Russia attacked Ukraine, we were basically in a space, in a narrative space, where suddenly Russia was overturning all the rules, where it was about might is right and one can attack another country and possibly come through with it. And Germany provided with its shift the counter story to that. So it provided this a little bit superficial story, but to some extent successful story of, well, this will not go through. There will be countries like Germany who were always restrained, but who will stand up to Russia's aggression. And I think this is, at least in terms of thinking about how in the history books later Russia's war and the whole era we live in will be described, this provides some important counter-narrative and also added to the whole feeling that the West has been very much revived through this war. We often forget that only a year before the war we had the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was a terrible example for the unity of the West. And now suddenly it seems that the West is very much back. So at the moment, perhaps the symbolic value of the Zeitenwende weighs heavier than the actual value in terms of implementation.
I appreciate the effort to stay positive here. We do want to do that, but at the same time, I do want to bring in a question from John Denny in the chat, who has the sense that he's saying, from what I've heard, we're letting Chancellor Scholz off the hook by being too easy on him, especially, it's a long question, but I think in essence, where's the leadership here on this, right? Didn't February 24th and then 27th, the speech offer an opportunity to take a German public that was very, that was shocked by what was going on and what Russia was doing in Ukraine, Putin was doing, and was perhaps there was an opening for leadership to shape much more of a shift back then, and has both the implementation issues and some of the debates and disputes we've seen around weapons deliveries really been a leadership issue. I'll throw that out to the group. Maybe I'll put Tyson on the spot first to get a reaction from him.
I don't think it would be fair for us to give too much of a rosy characterization of the implementation of the Zeitenwende. Even if you look at today's speech, there are two elements that really stood out to me. Today's speech by Scholz in the Bundestag. One is it seemed to be very retrospective. It didn't lay out plans for future implementation, which gives me the sense that he is looking to outsource this, spin it off to his new defense minister, which is understandable. But in a coalition with three parties that are not necessarily natural partners, paradoxically, that actually concentrates a lot of more power in the chancellery. So the chancellor's agency is actually quite strong in this area in defense modernization in Germany, and his active role is going to be necessary. The points that he highlighted around the F-35 procurement, FCAS, and work on joint air defense in Europe are trees, but they're thin trees when given the context of the forest of Zeitenwende. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. The other thing is, in contrast to the speech a year ago, where you had remarkable unity, I mean, the Chancellor commanded a great deal of unity and support, cross-party support in his Bundestag speech last year. That was not the case today. There was a lot of criticism. There was a lot of skepticism about his assessment of the implementation of the Zeitenwende. And I think that criticism is only going to increase going forward. Then on the limitations of Zeitenwende as a kind of strategic matter, he has been very clear in saying that the Zeitenwende does not apply to necessarily to Germany's relationship with China, for example, where he does see more of a sense of business as usual. And I think where Scholz has taken up a little more interest in kind of Germany's positioning in the world has been to build de-risking and resilience strategy that includes China, that includes many countries in the global south. He has become much more engaged in building trade relationships, supporting FTAs, supporting critical materials partnerships, looking at new markets for even German defense industry. He mentioned this in India just this week. And thinking about a +1 strategy, which I wouldn't even say is just a China +1 strategy in order to diversify with China in the context, but a +1 strategy with all partners, because all partners can be can have changes in their strategic orientation. And I think that for Scholz includes the United States. So I think that there are a lot of questions still needing to be answered. And I think that even if we say that this is a work in progress, the conditions are not as good as they were a year ago. And just to add one more point on the coalition and the instability of the coalition, it's not just that, you know, Pistorius's request for an annual plus-up of 10 billion was met with skepticism within the SPD and the Greens. There's also the FDP, the other coalition partner, which is looking at fiscal consolidation and a return to the debt brake, yet another break in German political discourse, after a period of extraordinary kind of fiscal expansion. After COVID, the special allotment, the 100 billion, and then the 200 billion energy cost cushion implemented last year. So I think that there's going to be a push, especially from the FDP, actually, to look at fiscal consolidation in the next year, especially given that their political fortunes are actually quite weak at the moment in Germany.
Thank you, Tyson. Britta, did you want to come in on the leadership question?
Yeah, I'm glad to do so. Well, you know, I think we really also have to take into account what kind of personality the chancellor is. And we may, you know, search for some kind of strong leadership, as in, I have my vision, my goals, I know what to do, and I'll try to convince public opinion and my allies and partners, and, you know, be a front runner. I don't see this, you know, really in him. I see him much more as a, maybe if you will, as a successor also of our former chancellor in that regard, you know, being much more of I'm this kind of cautious, deliberate, balanced leader, you know, not just pushing through and taking making quick decisions, but be more on the cautious side there. Always, you know, talking to my allies, maybe wait and see a little bit, hesitate, but to him, I guess, this is an expression of, you know, reasonable leadership there, not to be too quick on anything that you may not be able to return. So this might make it difficult to really see this kind of leadership that maybe we in our discussion like to see in, but I think there's one reason for it, that he remains much more in the tradition of the Grand Coalition, to be honest. And I maybe also just one point on the strategic communication, and Liana mentioned that before, and I think that's really critical, that in my view, he is convinced that it's the right way to follow public opinion. I think what would be crucial would be to go out there, try to explain, try to convince people, try to convince them why is it now such a crucial moment in time, what has to be done, what is our vision, why is it crucial for Germany to be a leader also in Europe and a strong partner in the transatlantic alliance, and what is necessary for that, and what will be also the consequences economically, politically, militarily. But this needs a lot of explanation and conviction. And then I am convinced, at least, that the public opinion also might follow you on that, because they may understand better, okay, what drives you and what are your reasons for that. But I see in him more of a kind of a leadership that says, I will always look at what is the public opinion, what do people want, and what is the more cautious way to do it.
I want to continue along that line of also the public opinion dimension. And there's a good question from David in the Q&A that I want to bring Liana and Alina in. He asks, the New York Times reports today that a cooling of US taxpayer opinion on support for Ukraine. Do we see a similar shift in Germany? And what are the prospects of Germany and the EU continuing to support Ukraine if the US starts to wind down support? I want to sort of summarize those questions a little bit. Liana, maybe a word on your impressions of German public opinion and whether Zeitenwende has sunk in and has support, and there is the potential of that leadership that Britta talked about. And then Alina, you already talked about Central European expectations, but more broadly, the Chancellor has made those single yardstick, what does the US do? If we simplify, what is the US doing in terms of its actions vis-a-vis Russia, its support for Ukraine? And often that sends a signal that Germany is not really willing to lead in Europe on, or can be understood. And maybe get your sense on that second question that's sort of related to what Britta and Tyson already mentioned. But Liana, first, maybe on the public opinion dynamics and Zeitenwende.
I think what is interesting in the public opinion part is that many of the policy areas that are part of Zeitenwende, reducing energy dependence, spending more, sending weapons to Ukraine, are areas where the German public followed leadership decisions. And I would 100% subscribe to what Britta said. It was often the case that the public was divided on an issue, and once the government took a decision, the public went with it. But if you ask Germans in a more general sense whether they want to have a military leadership role or leading military role in Europe, then you get a lot of pushback, because this kind of triggers all the alarm bells in the German public. But if you drill it down to the parts of this question, to the policy parts of it, defend Eastern allies, arm Ukraine, increase defense spending, then there's sort of a lot of support, which again supports the idea that it is also a shift of mindset that has to happen. But on the policy side, it looks surprisingly good. On the perhaps one quick comment on the question: what if the US changes its approach? Because I think this is a big discussion. It will become an even bigger discussion next year. It is one of the paradox of this war and of the crisis that US leadership has been so successful in the war that it is almost too successful for its own good. So in 2008 and 2014, we always have seen a strong German and French wall. Some may say, well, good that we don't have a strong German and French wall in this war because it didn't work out exactly great in 2008 and 2014. But this leads to a situation where Europeans feel pretty comfortable and in their comfort zone with following US leadership and not assuming the same kind of leadership responsibilities, even on economic and financial help for Ukraine. There's a lot of push from the United States. And that, again, makes it so difficult. We will probably not see a complete shift of US support for Ukraine, but we might see a shift where we don't see the same amount of money that was committed, where we see military support but no economic support for Ukraine, with the argument that Europeans have to step in. And I don't see Europeans or Germany and France being prepared for the shift. So at the moment, it's sort of being happy about where the alliance is, being happy about having Biden as a transatlanticist president, but not really investing in an own European leadership role. And just as a very last comment on the China piece, because I think it's crucial that Tyson mentioned it, what we see now is a very interesting development, which might turn our conversation around the discussion about Chinese lethal weapon deliveries to Russia. If there's one area which can push Europeans more and stronger and faster into the direction of assuming a more critical role of China and of recalibrating European China policy, it is how China relates to Russia's war in Ukraine. So if we see China pulling through with lethal weapon deliveries to Ukraine, we will have this discussion, which was already reported yesterday by Reuters, about sanctions on Russia by Europeans. And that might be one area where China will shoot itself in the foot if it actually comes closer to Russia, but at the same time tries to continue to charm Europeans, because the war is really such a priority issue for Europeans right now.
Alina, jump in with a sort of that point on Germany in Europe and the leadership role.
Historically, Central Europeans were much more comfortable with the American leadership than with the German leadership, because in terms of understanding and reading of
No. Give Alina 1 second.
the situations, Americans were much. Is it working now?
You're back now, yes, but you
Sorry
might have
about
to start from the beginning.
Right, I'll try again. So from historical perspective, Central Europeans were always much more comfortable with American leadership than with the German leadership, just because simply and clearly Americans were much closer to Central Europeans in their assessment of security threats and what can be done about them. So of course, from that perspective, and even if we look at the shared capabilities that Americans possess and that Europeans do not have yet, not having Americans contributing to Ukraine would significantly change the equation. Also because when Europeans think about how much they can contribute, they think about the art of the possible. And everybody knows that if Americans are on board, we can achieve much more. So that also kind of spearheads the European commitments. But it's also clear, and by the way, these voices are already pretty loud from the American side, that Europeans have contributed much more, not necessarily only in terms of the military support, but in terms of financial commitments, being for reconstruction of Ukraine in the future, but already now in terms of making sure that we can restore the energy grid in Ukraine and so on. So this push is already out there and it will become even more pronounced. And by the way, American taxpayers are actually, it's a two-way street. So American taxpayers will be much more willing to pay for the war in Ukraine and for reconstruction if they see that Europeans are contributing at least as much as Americans do, or even more. So I guess like this snowball of if everybody contributes, we will continue doing so is important also for the future.
Thank you, Lena. Tyson has a quick reaction. Jump in.
Because Alina mentioned something that's really important, I think, for the domestic political context on both sides of the Atlantic. When I listen to way that U.S. politics, the political dynamics in the United States, are instrumentalized in Berlin political discourse. I hear a lot of time, well, what if, Biden's not around, or there's a change in Washington that leads to a less Atlanticist inflection? But it's instrumentalized not as a way to drive action, but to decelerate action. It's used to put the brakes on engagement.
Yeah.
And that seems like entirely the wrong lesson to take from that posture. Because, if this is the kind of relationship that Germany and Berlin wants to have, then now is the time to invest in it, because it needs to be demonstrated that it provides political dividends for those who are making that case. And I think Alina makes the exactly right point, that if this is going to be a partnership among equals for European security on a continent, which of course is much closer, where the conflict is much closer, 3 hours by plane, to Germany than to the United States, then that is the kind of strategic messaging, to use Liana's term, that this government needs to be making to its people.
So let me follow up on that real quick, Liana, and maybe Britta as well. Where's the urgency and where's the pressure from DC? We haven't really seen that, and even with the tanks, and that debate, I think the open pressures hasn't really been there from the United States. Liana, if you want to jump in first.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting part. I was actually surprised when I came back to Washington in October last year that there was such, at least in the public, such a positive attitude towards Germany by the US administration. Because being back in Europe, Germany was bashed from all sides. You couldn't go anywhere without getting all this kind of criticism. And then you arrive in Washington and the administration is showering Germany in praise for stepping up, for having a leadership role. Everyone knows that Germany was not really having a leadership role. So I think what we see is some kind of concern that by criticizing Germany too harshly, Germany might sort of drop the ball on Zeitenwende. And so it's sort of the slow trying to, by giving Germany all those kinds of praise and carrots, trying to pull Germany along. On the one hand, it's a realization that Germany's Zeitenwende has a strategic significance also for the United States, because in the long term, the question is, how deeply can the United States become involved in European security if they look towards the Indo-Pacific at the same time? So the question of trade-off and resources will come up. And there obviously a Germany which can free up some of US resources in Europe, or at least alleviate the burden of the US in Europe, would be of course crucial. And the only episode that we've seen where this kind of patience of the US side was not there anymore was the tank episode. And that was really something where the communication of Berlin denying a linkage between Abrams and Leopards, which was discussed for months in the open, and then spinning the whole story not as the United States finally giving the green light to a leadership role that Germany didn't want to assume. And basically where Germany told the UK that was willing to send their own tanks, the Challenger tanks, well, you are not enough for us as a wingman, thanks so much, but we wait for the big guys, for the US to come. And the spin that was put on it from Berlin as this 3D chess game by Berlin, which in the end had the aim to get as many tanks as possible for Ukraine, was really upsetting to Washington. And I think this is one of the reasons, there are different interpretations, but it's one of the reasons why we've seen this Jake Sullivan comments. It might also have a domestic message to explain why the Abrams take so long, but it might also have the message to remind Germans that this episode is not forgotten, and this was really something where the administration here was not happy about.
Thank you, Liana. Britta, I want to come to you, but everyone get ready for a lightning round at the end, quick answer. But before that, one of our viewers is asking about, and you mentioned this, the structures to set Germany up for success for a more comprehensive strategic shift, whether that's a mentality, but also policy and implementation. You mentioned the National Security Council, National Security Strategy. There's a China strategy that's on ice. all three concepts are nice in many ways. So can you talk just briefly about that? Like, what are you seeing in terms of actually part of Zeitenwende is setting Germany up better, more effectively for success in being more strategic and engaging on all of these issues and taking the leadership role?
Yeah, I really do think it's super difficult at the moment, and I really hope that it's there's going to be a better basis to work on for this coalition government. But as you said, China strategy, national security strategy, everything comes down at the moment to a conflict between the chancellery and the foreign ministry, from what I heard. So definitely there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of really different positions there. But I think still what their where their importance also now is, or their focus of the government, and this also relates a little bit to what Diana said and what you asked of where was the pressure. The very important thing right now is really to demonstrate unity, to demonstrate action. And I know this can be something kind of symbolic. I mean, on the one hand, we say it's not really working, within the government, that there's no real concept, there are no strategies. But on the outside, let's say, it's a lot about unity, about sticking together. When we think of the United Nations General Assembly and the vote there, 141 votes, and it was really like calling every state in the global south personally and convincing them, hey, you have to be there. It's really crucial that we have this sign of unity. And this was also the spirit of the Munich Security Conference. And I also talked there to American friends, and I was already criticizing a little bit the German government and said, why are you not like outraged why this is taking so long? And they said, no, we really acknowledge where Germany comes from and what they did in this first year. And now, as Jana said, don't be too hard on them, because then the result would be that they maybe don't put too much effort in it. But I think we really have a gap there of trying to show your willingness to act and also your unity, and at the same time internally within this government, it's a huge challenge.
So I want to close with a lightning round. We'll kick off with Alina and then go around and just give us a really quick, about 2 minutes left, for Zeitenwende year 2. The one recommendation you would put in Chancellor Scholz's ear after his speech earlier today, how whether it's on the strategic comms, implementation, or the leadership dimension, as Liana so nicely outlined, what would be the one recommendation you would put to the Chancellor if you had the chance? Alina, and then we'll go to Tyson, Liana, and Britta. Please keep Pistorius as the German foreign minister and let him do his job with the swagger that he is showing right now. Okay, defense minister, but great. Moving to Tyson.
Mr. Chancellor, you can't outsource these policies. You have to own them in the Chancellery. Even if we don't want to fetishize institutions, fetishize the National Security Council and whatever, but the Chancellery can't operate as a decelerator, as a brake, and can't outsource these strategic areas. It has to own them with clear lines of effort that need to be checked on regularly.
Thank you, Tyson. And Liana?
Invest in the Weimar Triangle, in the German-French-Polish relationship, because there's really nothing worse than the lack of trust that we have in Europe, where the Poles are calling Washington to put pressure on Paris and Berlin, and Paris and Berlin are calling Washington to constrain Warsaw. So that's not great. It's not great for the US. It's not great for Europeans. We've seen some efforts, a meeting, Weimar Triangle, a common statement, but get over especially the Polish-German terrible state of relations, and not only looking towards the Polish elections, but in general. So revive the think tanker favorite Weimar Triangle.
Thank you, Liana. And Britta, close us out.
please communicate. Please let the public know where you are heading and what your plans and ideas are, because without the right communication, the risk that you lose public support for really, really necessary measures, and thus also the risk to the stability of our democracy and democracies is really high.
Well, thank you. That wraps us up for what I thought was a really engaging and diverse conversation about Zeitenwende, a very mixed assessment to stay positive. We want to continue that conversation here at the Europe Center. Please continue to follow our work on Germany, Europe, and the transatlantic partnership. And a huge thank you to our great panel here, Liana, Tyson, Britta, and Alina. Thank you so much, and hope we can reconvene you soon for another progress assessment. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
Thank you so much.